Welcome everyone. This PowerPoint presentation is regarding the Quechuan students who rallied on Parliament Hill in relation to the historical and legal aspects of Aboriginal peoples. In 1957, a complaint was filed asking for the Quechuan First Nations community to change locations so that the constant evacuations of the community, as a result of flooding, would no longer arise. That being ignored, it is now 2018 and young Quechuan students have nowhere to go to school. The elementary students now have to attend high school, and the high school students will attend school at a later hour. After a large group of children from the Quechuan First Nations traveled to Ottawa to bring attention to the issue, Indigenous Service Minister Jane Philpott was forced to address the issue in person. The issues being focused on in this presentation are the issues of education, health, legal colonial influence, and the promises that were made but not properly maintained in Canada. The education issue in this setting is that the students are receiving a lesser education due to the fact that there was a lack of upkeep in the school. The results of this was a confusing new structure of education that can cause issues for not only the elementary Quechuan students attending a more mature school, but the high school students that now have to attend school at a different time, perhaps missing out on extracurriculars, employment, etc. Another issue is health. The issue of health in the school is very problematic. The fact that the school got to a point of developing mold and flooding without anyone noticing is violating many health codes. Another issue is the legal colonial influence. This will be discussed further in detail later in the PowerPoint, but briefly, responsibility and accountability for actions need to be taken. It is no longer, nor was ever, acceptable to treat Aboriginal people in the way that they are still being treated today. The last issue I have mentioned is the promises that Canada, in particular Justin Trudeau, have mentioned to reconcile further actions. Justin Trudeau made 94 promises with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to help in reconciling with the past and ameliorating the lifestyle of Aboriginal people. However, multiple of these promises have already been violated. Evidently, colonialism is the root cause of these issues. However, it is a broad statement that does not define the direct historical problem that has resulted in the lack of upkeep in Quechuan First Nations community elementary schools. It is inherently the evidence post-colonialism that had influence on the results of today. In the 19th century, when the assimilation and displacement of Indigenous communities by the Canadian government was common, ultimately led the Quechuan First Nations community to be situated on such a floodplain, displacing the community on an inhabitable land. The residential schools put in place can be related to this context as the imposition of European beliefs upon Indigenous children, while depriving them of proper education, food, and health conditions, have similarities to the current situation. It is not as severe, however, it is another instance where Indigenous children are lacking a proper education and resources in their school environment, which is now unsafe and unhealthy. After the 94 calls of actions were put into place as a result of the lawsuit against the federal government in the late 1990s, there still manages to be children who are suffering from inadequate education and breaching safety regulations at the hands of the European colonization in Canada. This slide deciphers the legal context in the case of the Quechuan First Nations students. Law has always been a significant tool in aiding the changing effects of colonialism. However, law has also been and continues to be a tool for the oppression of Aboriginal peoples. The Constitution Act of 1982, Section 35, subsection 2, is an important milestone guaranteeing the rights of Aboriginal people. This is a valuable section that enables the liberty of many Aboriginal communities. They were the first lawkeepers of the world, however, at the time, law was considered a set of stories to govern relations. The federal government, through the Indian Act, attacked traditional governance structures and asserted control over every aspect of life on reserves. That changed in the 1980s/1990s. However, looking at the case of the Quechuan students, they have neglected to implement any aid in the sanitation and upkeep of their infrastructures. There was no intent of fiduciary relations in this scenario, as the interests of the First Nation community were neglected and put behind the Crown when they made their original complaint of their location in 1957. The fiduciary duty should have been acknowledged when the original complaint of the location of their land was made. An important thing to remember is the greater political awareness and activism led to the inclusion of Aboriginal and treaty rights in the Constitution Act 1982. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission have created 94 calls of actions to reconcile with the Canadian government's past and present actions. In the case of the Quechua First Nations community, the 94 recommendations have been violated primarily in the education section, subsections 7, 9, 10, and 11, which discuss the upkeep of the environment of schools as well as the proper education of these students. In the past, treaty rights have been protected by Section 35 of the Constitution Act. These principles are that a treaty is an exchange of solemn promises and ambiguities resolved in the favor of the Aboriginal party. However, we still do not see that being resolved today. The honor of the Crown is important in the context as it presumes that the Crown intends to fulfill its promises and obligations. Honor of the Crown is engaged wherever Section 35 applies, and in the case of Quechuan students, Section 35 applies, as the students are fighting for basic educational rights. However, the honor of the Crown has not been implemented throughout their situation. The criminal justice system is relevant in this case because of the high number of dropouts in First Nations communities and the higher number of people going to jail who are from Aboriginal communities. The lack of care that the government has demonstrated towards the education system in First Nation communities has shown how these students will not feel as though their education is important and can lead them to the incompletion of school, which is largely associated with the people who are committing criminal actions. The overrepresentation of Aboriginal people happens in courts is as a result of the socioeconomic conditions. Aboriginal people are the poorer portions of Canada's citizens. From this, there will be an overrepresentation as most people will not be able to afford a lawyer to aid in representing them. In the case of the Quechuan students, if they do not have a completed high school diploma or any sort of education, it will be more difficult for them to find a job contributing to the socioeconomic conditions that they are put in. Judges will consider the historical factors when sentencing an Aboriginal person. There are important factors to be considered due to the fact that history, such as a lack of resources and care from the Canadian government towards Aboriginal schools, can play a role in influencing dropping out and other possible impacts on the human life. Gladue law is when there is a self-identifying Inuit, Métis, or First Nations represented in front of the law. This means that the court needs to consider the historical background of the person who is facing legal consequences. The 1957 complaint being ignored is important to recognize because each individual community has their own unique traditions, and that land is a large factor to their traditions, especially when considering Indigenous law and the natural law as one of the 5 sources of law. Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982, subsection 3, for greater certainty in subsection 1, treaty rights, includes rights that now exist by way of land claims agreements or may be so acquired. These lands are being flooded, and their rights to move and relocate to live in a more sustainable and habitable environment are being denied. In a broader context, the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples 2007, Article 26, which discusses the right of Indigenous peoples to the lands and resources. After the historical displacement, these rights need to be recognized, and the acknowledgement of an unsafe community should be also taken into account. I think it is important to note that when discussing the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Canada was one of the countries voting against this declaration, and that after originally promising to implement the declaration in Canadian law, the Trudeau government reversed course in June 2016. Looking at this story with a broader scope, we can see that there is still a large struggle in the obtainment of sovereignty and rights of Aboriginal people today, and that it is not just a historical issue. There is also a large imbalance in the Aboriginal legal system. The law can oftentimes not protect the rights of Aboriginal people and actually enable them from fulfilling the roles as a Canadian citizen. It is important to keep in mind that the Quechuan First Nations community is First Nations, and each First Nation group has its own unique identity and culture. This is relevant in a broader context, as all across Canada there are various Aboriginal communities with differing traditions. Again, touching on the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People is a global step in the right direction to acknowledging the rights of Indigenous people. However, instances such as the Quechuan students' lack of education make us recognize that although we have made those steps, we still have a long way to go. In addition to this, we need to put more work into resolving the issues that are having repercussions on Aboriginal peoples today. In conclusion, I hope that this presentation has made you consider the legal and historical aspects of Aboriginal peoples, as well as the suffering that Quechuan students have been facing. If you would like to help these students, you can visit www.charlieangus.ca for more information. It is time we put an end to their suffering and become accountable for the Canadian government's actions.